It is not all that difficult. In fact, it might even be tempting to make the argument that the behavior, even the criminal conduct of the president's son, Hunter Biden, is not all that relevant to our public discourse. After all, so goes this rationale. Hunter Biden has never run for political office. He's not running for political office in 2024. Parents can't be held responsible for the conduct of their adult children any more than those adult children can be held responsible for the conduct of their parents. And the fact that Hunter Biden is or at least was, I guess the claim goes, a serious drug addict is something that is very well known, and it is often the case that people who get addicted to very serious narcotics or who become alcoholics because of those addictions are likely to engage in very morally questionable or unethical and often criminal behavior. The problem is that Hunter Biden was charged with federal crimes and was convicted in a federal courtroom, which means that the prosecutors who decided his fate were people who worked directly for the Biden Justice Department, who answered to Joe Biden's Attorney General, Merrick Garland. And there has been a lot going on in this case that absolutely does have very significant impact on many matters that are clearly of the public interest. I've never thought that Hunter Biden's personal life, his sex life, his drug usage was of any relevance to anything. That's his private life with presumably all adult consensual partners. No one has claimed otherwise. The question, though, is how has this case been handled, and what does it say about both the fairness of our justice system and the behavior of the American media? So just to give you the background on the charges for which he was convicted, we'll use the New York Times report from today. There you see the headline, Hunter Biden convicted of 3 felonies. Quote, President Biden's son, who has struggled with drug addiction, was convicted in a Delaware federal court on all 3 counts tied to a handgun purchase in 2018. His sentencing date has not been set. Quote, he could face up to 25 years in prison, but first-time offenders who did not use their weapons to commit a violent crime typically receive no jail time. No sentencing date was set. In September, Mr. Biden is scheduled to go on trial in Los Angeles for charges that he evaded a tax assessment, failed to file and pay taxes, and filed a false or fraudulent tax return. It is considered the more serious case against him. So he has another more serious case with more serious charges that is imminent, will likely be in September before the election. Today's guilty verdict, says the Times, in his gun case on Thursday raises the possibility that he would receive a stiffer sentence if a jury convicts him in the tax case, because federal guidelines take into account previous convictions, and then, of course, he would no longer be a first-time offender. Now, one of the things that I think is very interesting is that the court charge that they brought against Hunter Biden here is that he purchased a weapon, and under federal law, if you are an active drug addict or drug user, you are not permitted to purchase a firearm. And he had to fill out a form in which he attested to the fact that he was not an active drug user. And the basic charge against him that brought this trial was that he submitted a false statement in order to obtain a firearm because he was, in fact, a drug addict at the time that he falsely certified to the government and under the law that he was not. Now, technically, that is a crime. Wouldn't call it a very serious crime, especially since, as the article noted, he didn't actually use the firearm against anybody. But certainly it was the case that you could say exactly the same thing about Donald Trump, namely that altering your internal bookkeeping to cover up hush payments to a porn star might be technically illegal. I would suggest as a misdemeanor, but it's the kind of thing that would almost never be brought against anyone not named Donald Trump. And interestingly, I saw a lot of conservatives, a lot of Trump supporters today, on principle objecting to the conviction of Hunter Biden by arguing that Americans have the constitutional right to carry firearms and there's no drug addict or drug use exception to that constitutional right. That essentially the idea that you can't purchase a firearm without proving that you're not a drug addict is a violation of the Second Amendment. Seeing a lot of conservatives on principle objecting to Hunter Biden's conviction in this case, something that I have to say I did not see or can't recall seeing a single liberal doing, invoking in the principle about criminal justice or how courts work in order to make a similar defense about Donald Trump. That's something I find very interesting. The other aspect of this is that the real questions about Hunter Biden, criminally speaking, have never been in this case, have never been about his attempt to purchase a gun while being a drug addict. The real issues are the corruption that Hunter Biden engaged in places like Ukraine and China. That was what the New York Post was trying to report in 2020 when the entire media united against them to disparage that reporting falsely as the byproduct of Russian disinformation, reporting that big tech then tried to censor. The real question surrounding Hunter Biden's criminality is what it was that he was doing in Ukraine, a country where his father, as vice president, was basically running. Remember, Biden has often boasted, Joe Biden did, about the orders he gave to the Ukrainian government to remove certain prosecutors that he disliked, the threats that he made to the Ukrainians to withhold $1 billion in aid unless they followed his command to remove a prosecutor. I mean, Joe Biden was running Ukraine as kind of an imperial overlord, not at even the highest level of generality, but micromanaging all sorts of things at the same time that Hunter Biden was being paid $50,000 a month by a Ukrainian energy company, Burisma, despite no involvement or experience in that industry, no knowledge of it. And there's all kinds of evidence that Burisma tried and succeeded through Hunter Biden in gaining access to Joe Biden. And then on top of that, you have all sorts of very strange deals that Hunter Biden and President Biden's brother were pursuing together in China. And one of the memos that the New York Post found from the laptop that the media falsely said was a fabrication showed that Joe Biden had a potential profit participation in one of those deals. There's all kind of sketchiness and potential criminality on the part of not only Hunter Biden, but other members of his family, that in many ways this trial over these relatively trivial charges seem intended to conceal or to distract from. Now, the other aspect of it, of course, and we reported on this the other last week when the charges were first brought and an FBI agent took the stand to explain what the FBI's investigation entailed, and the FBI agent testified at length about how much they relied on the documents that came from Hunter Biden's laptop. The laptop that the entire media, the CIA, big tech united before the election to deliberately lie about, to call it Russian disinformation, even though there was never an iota of support to make that claim. We now know that claim was an absolute lie, and we've known it for many, actually, I knew it before the 2020 election. Media outlets admitted it shortly after Biden was elected. We've had all kinds of evidence since then that proves the authenticity of these documents, but the fact that Hunter Biden was just convicted based on the admissibility of evidence that they took from his laptop, the same one that we were told was Russian disinformation, couldn't be proven. As you know, I was prevented by my own media outlet from reporting on the contents of those documents based on the Intercept's claim that they got from the CIA, that there was doubt about the authenticity of those documents. This was something that the media did and very well may have swung the election, given that people were already concerned about Democrats and the kind of corruption in which they engaged, and they were simply barred from hearing about this story because the media instead focused on pronouncing it to be Russian disinformation. When Trump raised it in debate, Biden immediately said, "You're doing the Kremlin's work." And of course, the worst thing of all was that big tech censored it, Twitter for several days, but Facebook said they were algorithmically suppressing the story, and they won't answer questions about how long that lasted, but presumably it lasted through the end of the election, something far more consequential than what Twitter did. And yet this trial now proves this. From NBC News on June 5th, quote, "The Hunter Biden trial highlights FBI agent testifies about Hunter Biden's drug use and large cash withdrawals. The agent, a witness for the prosecution, testified about the authenticity of Hunter Biden's laptop, which has been the subject of rumors and speculation for years. The witness, FBI agent Erica Jensen, testified about the authenticity of Hunter Biden's laptop, which had been the subject of rumors. Johnson said the laptop contained evidence of Hunter Biden's drug and gun purchase, and the FBI agent explained exactly how they confirmed the authenticity of that email, namely subpoenaing Apple and seeing that the contents and the serial number were exactly the same. Now, one of the things that should not be forgotten about all this, because we did end up with a conviction here, is how much was done by prosecutors and other agencies in the executive branch that answer to Joe Biden to cover up and conceal and prevent any of this from ever seeing the light of day. I think one of the most remarkable things was that the prosecutors who were working for the special counsel negotiated a plea deal with Hunter Biden that was extraordinary. They said, if you plead guilty just to these gun charges, we will give you full immunity on every other conceivable criminal charge that you might face, even unrelated to these issues, including the ones I mentioned, such as the possibility of lobbying on behalf of foreign governments without registering it, a crime that they convicted many Trump officials, such as Paul Manafort, of having engaged in. It was a plea deal unlike ones you ever get for an ordinary citizen. And they did it in the back room. They did it just on the phone with Hunter Biden and his lawyers. And then there was a lot of speculation, a lot of concerns raised by people in Congress and by others that this deal seemed very overly generous, that it was designed not only to end this case with no jail time, but also to prevent any of the other future charges, the ones that are far more serious, from ever seeing the light of day. And that plea deal completely fell apart the minute that it was brought into the public light. Here's the New York Times article from July of 2023 that says, judge delays Hunter Biden's plea deal. Quote, the president's son had an agreement with prosecutors to plead guilty to 2 misdemeanor tax charges and avoid prosecution on a gun charge. The judge overseeing the case demanded more information from both sides. In other words, instead of just accepting the plea deal, she kind of just began questioning in public what this plea deal actually entailed. Quote, Judge Mary Ellen Norica has delayed a decision on whether even to accept the plea agreement between federal prosecutors and Hunter Biden, demanding that the two sides make changes in their deal, clarifying her role and insert language that limits the broad immunity for prosecution offered to Hunter Biden on his business dealings. From the start, the judge seemed highly skeptical of the unusual deal, which offered Hunter Biden broad immunity from prosecution in perpetuity. She was questioning why it had been filed under a provision that gave her no legal authority to reject the plea deal. When she asked Leo Wise, the prosecutor, if there was any precedent for the kind of deal being proposed, he replied, no, Your Honor. And what actually happened was in secret, the prosecutor said, you have full immunity on all charges. But once they had to explain themselves and justify the plea deal to the court upon just a little bit of judicial scrutiny, they were so embarrassed, the prosecutors were, by how generous this plea deal was, that on the spot they reinterpreted it and they told the judge it does not include other investigations and criminal activity that Hunter Biden may have been responsible for when it came to illegal foreign lobbying. And the minute the prosecutor said that, Hunter Biden's lawyers were outraged, correctly, because they said, that wasn't our plea deal. You told us that it covers all charges. But the prosecutors were too embarrassed to have the public know just how broad it was. They had to deny that it included all future charges, and that was when the plea deal fell apart, and then they took this case to trial. So there were all kinds of shenanigans as Democrats try and claim, oh, this proves the justice system isn't politicized, it is blind to who they're treating, even convicting the president's son. Remember how many times, not just that time, but when IR whistleblowers came forward, it was very clear that these prosecutors were doing everything possible to protect Hunter Biden in every way. Now, one of the things that has long disgusted me about the media's attempt to defend Hunter Biden, and we're seeing it in all sorts of different places now with this trial ongoing and then with the conviction, is the idea that, oh, actually, this is not about his criminality. It's actually a beautiful and moving story about a father's love for his son and the struggles that many families in America face in overcoming addiction. And of course, it is true that millions of Americans, either themselves or have members of their family, close family member or friends who struggle with addiction and alcoholism, and it can ruin their lives and wreck their lives. But they don't have the media launching a propaganda campaign to say that they shouldn't have to pay for any of the consequences of that because of this addiction. And yet, here's what the media has been doing from the start when it comes to Hunter Biden and only Hunter Biden. Here was the New York Times' Nicholas Kristof when these charges were brought. He said, quote, "The real meaning of the Hunter Biden saga, as I see it, isn't about presidential corruption, but instead is about how widespread addiction is and how about a determined parent with unconditional love can sometimes reel a child back. That can give others hope." It was not only something that didn't reflect negatively on Hunter Biden and his father, it was actually something that showed how beautiful they are, because the crimes that Hunter Biden committed were actually motivated by his addiction, for which we should not have any sort of anger toward him as a society or to seek to punish him, but only empathy. An idea which, by the way, I generally support, that addiction is more of a health problem than it is a penal problem, that addicts should be treated with resources and not put into prison. Obviously, that doesn't mean that crimes they commit, actual crimes, should be excused because they're addicts. But in general, I agree that that is the correct approach to drug addiction and alcoholism in the United States. And I would be celebrating this if it weren't for the fact that it's only being invoked not on behalf of all American families struggling with addiction and alcoholism, but only in the case of Hunter Biden. Here's a video of a segment that was done on Morning Joe about the Hunter Biden case yesterday that involved the extremely partisan columnist for the Daily Beast, Molly Young Fast, who grew up in Manhattan as the daughter of an extremely famous and wealthy novelist, Erica Young. And listen to, you can see the graphic on the screen, Republicans are going after Hunter Biden for his addiction, and they're playing a dangerous game. That was the title of the article she wrote, claiming that Republicans were going after Hunter Biden, not because he committed crimes, not because he was lobbying in Ukraine and China or pursuing business deals, but they were going after him because he's an addict. He was the victim here. The real victim was Hunter Biden. Listen to this.
You could talk a little bit more about this. It seems to me that it would be very hard to find a jury that has been untouched by addiction completely.
Yeah, and the reason that I wanted to come forward and write about this is because even though I've been sober since I was a teenager, I felt that the disease that Hunter Biden has is the same disease that I have, is the same disease that, you know, almost 20% of the country has. And, you know, Republicans do love to talk about, like, fentanyl coming over the border. Like, there's a reason that drugs are a problem in this country, and it's largely because of addiction. So this is another part of that. I think Republicans have really actually not had a lot of success using Hunter Biden to sully Joe Biden, but they have tried. One of the sort of moments in the debate where Biden ended up really being that Biden that voters really like was when he talked about his son's addiction, and he said, he struggled with addiction, he's made it through, and that he's incredibly proud of his son for that. And look, I came forward partially because I wanted to destigmatize this, and I feel like a lot of time, for a long time, alcoholism and addiction was this terrible secret we didn't talk about. I feel like for me, because I've been sober since I was a teenager, I have this ability to talk about it in a way that's a little bit...
Okay, she's so brave. She admitted she was an alcoholic when she was a teenager. And therefore, she shares the same illness as Hunter Biden. Now, as I said, I actually do believe strongly in this model of empathy for addicts, of using our resources to help them recover from that addiction or from that alcoholism instead of just throwing them in a prison cell where it's likely to get worse. But what sickens me about this is fake compassion. This is fake empathy. It's politicizing empathy for addiction. I want you to think about, have you ever heard major television outlets or a huge army of pundits coming forward to defend ordinary Americans who are being convicted of crimes that result from their addiction or from their alcoholism in this way. And what sickens me even more is this idea that, oh, Joe Biden is a particularly compassionate politician who Americans love when they get to see that side of him, and he's expressing so much support and empathy for his son's drug addiction, and that shows what kind of person Joe Biden is. The irony of that is that there is no single political official in Washington over the last several decades who has been a more aggressive, unapologetic, and unyielding supporter of imposing the harshest possible prison sentences, not on major drug lords or drug dealers, but on drug users. This empathy has never emerged or been seen in Joe Biden's entire life until it came time to defend his son. And I think the notion that someone has concern or compassion or empathy for a certain behavior only when it affects themselves and wants to throw everyone else in prison, far from being a character virtue, is a very repellent character flaw. Let me just show you one of Joe Biden's many, many speeches on this issue that completely contradict this narrative from 1991, where he was speaking on the Senate floor. Remember, he's been a senator since the 1970s when he was 29 years old.
Statements, but let's look at the facts. Since 1986, Congress has passed over 230 new or expanded penalties for drug and criminal offenses in this United States. 230 new penalties. And these penalties range from an automatic 5 years in jail for any person caught with a rock of crack cocaine, a piece of crack cocaine as small as a quarter. I don't have a quarter with me, but if you visualize what one looks like, yeah, I do have a quarter. If you have a piece of crack cocaine no bigger than this quarter that I'm holding in my hand, 1/4 of $1, we passed a law through the leadership of Senator Thurmond and myself and others, a law that says if you're caught with that, you go to jail for 5 years. You get no probation. You get nothing other than 5 years in jail. Judge doesn't have a choice. Now, the fact of the matter is, we've gone from there all the way up to saying, under the leadership of Senator Thurmond, and I'd like to suggest that I take some small credit for it myself as well, and others, the presiding officer, that there is now a death penalty. And we passed it a couple years ago. If you are a major drug dealer involved in the trafficking of drugs and murder results in your activities, you go to death.
Okay, so we've all by now seen the video of Hunter Biden using crack cocaine. The amount of crack cocaine that he had and was using was far, far, far bigger than that quarter that Joe Biden was referring to. And in that video, Joe Biden was boasting of the fact that a law that he helped implement required, not permitted a judge, but required a judge to send anybody possessing crack cocaine, even in a tiny amount, to go directly to prison for 5 years with no possibility of parole or mitigation or any kind of understanding of their situation. And this is something that he's done his entire career. He has never apologized for this, rescinded this, said that he was in error. So this idea that Joe Biden is empathetic to drug users, and we all should be so moved by that, is a complete revision of the actual history of the actual behavior of Joe Biden and his attempt to imprison. And of course, doing that with crack cocaine also had major racial disparities. It put a huge number of black people in prison whose crime was nothing other than being a drug addict, using crack cocaine that they got hooked on, just like Joe Biden's son did. And so to watch this kind of serious issue about how we treat addiction, how we deal with communities ravaged by addiction, trifled with and played with and so cynically manipulated simply to defend Hunter Biden, when the real story is how the Biden Justice Department, just like they've been going after Trump, tried to do everything to shield his son, is truly sickening. But it gives you an idea of just how these partisan channels are willing to say literally anything to distort reality right in front of your eyes in order to achieve their partisan objective. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.